Welcome everyone to the sixth session of the Schoolyard Forest Design Lecture Series. My name is Lauren McKenna with Green Schoolyards America, and supporting me today are my colleagues Michaela Randolph and Rachel Pringle. Today's agenda will include some intros from us, a presentation covering how schoolyard forests and living schoolyards can help reduce extreme heat, followed by some Q&A time with our guest speakers. I just want to take a moment to introduce some new staff that have recently joined our Green Schoolyards America team. Michaela Randolph, who's here today, is our new Associate Director of Regional Programs. She'll help advance school greening and partnerships in the Los Angeles and Southern California region and beyond. And Sarah Matsumoto is our new Director of Policy and Government Affairs, and she'll help advance equitable policies in environment, education, and health by strategizing with key officials, community leaders, and partner organizations. The series is part of the National Schoolyard Forest System, an initiative to increase tree canopy on public school grounds across the U.S. to shade and protect pre-K through 12th grade students from extreme heat and rising temperatures due to climate change. Support systems that are needed to expand these efforts, increasing tree canopy, include understanding and sharing schoolyard design, implementation and management practices, as well as professional learning, such as this lecture series. California is the first state in this initiative, founded by Green Schoolyards America and 10 Strands in partnership with CAL FIRE and the California Department of Education. We also hope that you'll check out our National Schoolyard Forest System Library, which includes many, many resources. Related to today's topic, the How Cool is Your School activity will help students understand the impact that design and surface materials have on temperature and microclimates in their schoolyard. It guides students in measuring and assessing surface temperatures, analyzing the results, and proposing design solutions. The guide, How to Select Trees for Your Schoolyard, offers support on choosing tree species that provide shade and are climate adapted. And from our previous online library, our outdoor learning library, we have an introductory guide on considerations for outdoor learning in hot weather. Of course, our guest speakers today will talk a lot more about that topic. And we know many of you are active in advocating for planting and creating schoolyard forests or caring for existing forests in your community. We're going to share a link to some case studies, which we hope to expand upon. We're just getting started. The link also has a survey where you can submit info and photos about your own schoolyard forests. We'd love to hear from you and see pictures from across the US and abroad. And we're considering how we might share those efforts with this community. And thank you if you've already submitted. Before we start today's lecture, I just want to remind everyone that this series will run through 2024. The first Thursday of each month, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time. The goal is to offer technical design-focused guidance for creating and stewarding high-quality green schoolyards and schoolyard forests. All of the lectures are free and made publicly available the following week. Some upcoming topics include wildlife habitat in schoolyards, maintenance and stewardship, and much more. Our next lecture is Thursday, May 2nd, and we hope that you'll invite some friends and colleagues to join us. All right, so on to today's topic. We're very excited to have some researchers who are experts in this, reducing extreme heat and supporting thermal comfort with schoolyard forests. I like to tell adults that when we think about heat and comfort at schools, imagine taking your lunch break in a really, really hot parking lot with no shade on a very hot day and comparing that to being in your favorite park with big canopied shade trees. That we consider this a public health issue, especially for young children that have small bodies. And with rising temperatures, it's so important to consider vegetation and trees as solutions to reducing heat and increasing comfort. Our speakers today will help us understand the research behind heat and our environment. So to introduce them, um, Dr. Kelly Turner is an associate professor of urban planning and geography and serves as associate director of the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. She leads the center's research on heat equity, which provides evidence-based approaches to protect people, especially vulnerable populations, where they live and work. Her recent research encompasses heat governance and policy, planning for climate resilient communities, and producing actionable data for heat health equity. Dr. Turner teaches interdisciplinary courses in environmentalism, urban sustainability, and urban ecology. She has a doctoral degree in geography from Arizona State University and a BA in political science from Wellesley College. Dr. Ariane Middel is an associate professor of the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on how urban form and design affect heat and human thermal exposure. Dr. Middel has advanced urban climate science through applied and solutions-oriented research using unconventional field methods such as MARDI, a mobile weather station, microclimate simulations, and human-centric modeling. Dr. Middel is the president of the International Association for Urban Climate and directs the Shade Lab at ASU, which brings together students from multidisciplinary backgrounds to deliver creative solutions for urban climate challenges confronting our society. And our third speaker today is Dr. Jennifer Vanos, who is associate professor studying the intersection of climate and human health in the School of Sustainability at also Arizona State University. She works to strengthen the understanding and practice surrounding how we protect people within vulnerable groups from extreme heat and air pollution in urban areas. Her work on extreme heat addresses risks and challenges with vulnerable populations, including children, athletes, and outdoor workers. Dr. Vanos is a scientific advisor for the National Program for Playground Safety and chair of the American Meteorological Society's Board on Environment and Health. Lots of accolades for these three today. Thank you for being here, Kelly, Ariane, and Jennifer. And I will let you take it from here.
We're really excited to speak to this group that's working on an area that's near and dear to all of our hearts, based on our collective research and our combined interdisciplinary efforts working together. A lot of what you're going to hear today can be found in a publication. We'll have a QR code a little bit later that we produced in Nature about shade infrastructure, and is really going to focus on how things like schoolyard greening can be helpful in that endeavor. So next slide. So today we'll do a little setting the stage. Why is this an issue? And why does heat on the playground matter? I love your analogy. Imagine taking your work break on a black top with no trees. I mean, that sounds pretty awful, quite frankly, to me. And then we will talk about how you can cool playgrounds through design and the impacts on thermal comfort and stress, the health impacts on children. We'll highlight some work that Jenny has done on heat-ready schools that can serve as a pathway forward for schools anywhere, really. And then turn to some policy recommendations that might be helpful. So yeah, schools are too hot. What you're looking at here is sort of a macro and a micro view. So on the left side, you're looking at just satellite imagery showing land surface temperature, so an estimate of the skin temperature of the Earth. And if you look at that big red spot down there and that big blue spot, the red is hot, the blue is cool, and that is a school in Watts. And it is one of the hottest parts. That red spot specifically is both an artificial turf field and an asphalt playground area. So the hottest area in all of Watts in Los Angeles is a school play yard. And if you look on the right side, at this sort of micro view, you can see school play structures, and those are hot enough to cause really severe burns. And you can see that the structures themselves are quite hot, but the asphalt is hot and the rubber matting can be even hotter. So it's really essential to do something about these surfaces. But as we'll see in a little bit, surface temperature isn't the only one that matters. Next slide.
So I'm going to just tee it up on this slide for a minute, thinking really holistically around what some of what Kelly just mentioned means, but why it's a problem to be kind of designing in a way that's so hot when it's already warm out and getting hotter. So playgrounds and schoolyards are hot, as Kelly just showed, and they're getting hotter depending on reasons from urban heat island effect to global climate change. We know that kids are vulnerable to heat in the sun for various reasons, whether that's psychological and experience, not having the experience of what heat illness feels like or what to do about it, or having the ability to go get water, go inside when they need to, versus their physiological vulnerability around the ability to lose heat from the skin and sweat as much as an adult can. Kids don't sweat as much yet, so they can't lose heat in the number one way that we need to. And then there's often design solutions that are lacking for, quote, heat safety. And I put heat in quotes because Dr. Middel is going to go over what we mean by heat. It's not just air temperature, it's not just surface temperature. There's so much more to what a hot day and a hot location means for people and kids. When we put all of these together, they can decrease the amount of play, the ability to go out and enjoy the weather, and especially safe play. And so what are some of those concerns that we worry about? Next slide.
Okay, I'm taking over. So you all probably have experienced this. It's, the same day you walk in different parts of the town and locations just feel different. So what you see here is Marty, and I'm going to explain in a little bit what Marty is. It's a mobile weather station, but there are two locations we put Marty in. One is a asphalt parking lot in Phoenix, and the other location is a kind of grassy, shaded location on campus. Looks quite green. The air temperature that day and that time was 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It gets pretty hot here in Phoenix. But then if you are like Marty, under the tree over grass, you might feel like it's maybe 98. It's not too bad, right? But then if you're standing on this asphalt parking lot, it might actually feel like it's 125 or even more. And the air temperature is exactly the same. So this brings me to different types of temperature, because when we talk about temperature casually, we always talk about air temperature. It's what we get, on our app, on our phone, the weather forecast, and we follow that air temperature. But it's the temperature of the air that surrounds us, and it's not the most relevant temperature when it comes to how people actually experience the heat. So there's another type of temperature, and there will be some slides coming up from Dr. Vanos on the surface temperature that are a bit disturbing. Surface temperature is the temperature of a surface as you would touch it. So if you think about your stovetop and you touch the stovetop, you tell your kids don't touch it because it gets hot. That's the surface temperature. Or your asphalt parking lot that you saw on the previous slide. As you were to touch this asphalt parking lot, that is much hotter than the actual air temperature. So surface temperature refers to the temperature of the actual surface. Again, there are a lot of surface temperature products, satellite images that you see where people produce these color-coded maps of how hot it is in certain areas. And Kelly showed a picture of this earlier on WAP and watts. So this is the actual surface temperature. And again, it's not necessarily the temperature you experience as a person as you're walking over the surface. So the most important temperature in this context is called the mean radiant temperature, and that is the radiation that hits your body from all directions. So that includes the direct sunlight, that's the shortwave radiation, so that's the visible sunlight that hits your body when you're standing in the sun, not in the shade. It's the heat that comes off of hot surfaces. So if you're standing on this asphalt parking lot, the parking lot heats up, the heat that radiates at your body. So all of these types of radiations that hit your body from all directions, that's the mean radiant temperature. And that is in dry, hot areas such as Los Angeles, the Southwest, is one of the really key drivers of how comfortable people would feel or how heat stressed people would feel in the urban environment. So now you can see, since the mean radiant temperature includes the direct sunlight or the radiation, that shade will play a really key role, and we'll talk a lot about shade in this presentation. This group, led by Kelly Turner, published a publication in Nature recently that talks about the importance of shade and how a lot of cities are actually shade deserts, kind of like food deserts, but in the context of heat. And this slide that you see here illustrates how shade works. So we have two individuals here at a bus stop. The one individual is standing in the sun on his phone, and you see that there is direct sunlight hitting his body. That's the yellow arrows coming down. But then, since the surface this person is standing on heats up, there's also heat radiating back at the person from the bottom. And then, because the surface is probably higher reflective, it's a concrete surface, there's also some of that sunlight reflected back at the person's body. So this person feels quite hot, and the heat load on this person's body is probably 10 or 20 degrees Celsius, which is 30 degrees Fahrenheit more than the heat load on the person that's standing under the bus shelter. That's the person to the left under the shelter. You see that the direct sunlight hits the bus shelter, but it does not directly hit the body of the person. The bus shelter heats up a little bit because of the direct sunlight and then emits some of the heat onto the body of the person, but it's not as much heat as the direct sunlight. And then also the surface underneath, the ground surface, does not heat up as much because it's not hit by the direct sun. So there's less radiation hitting the person's body from the bottom. You see shade works in cooling the person's body in two ways. And I'm going to hand it over to Kelly now to talk a little bit more about shade.
So frequently when cities are talking about shade, it's as a co-benefit of trees and urban forestry. And that's really intuitive. A lot of us think about trees providing shade, but shade can be cast by any vertical object, because all you really need is something that's going to block the sun from hitting both bodies and hitting those surfaces that might re-radiate heat back at you. So trees are a great option, but buildings can also, multi-story buildings can provide shade, as can shade sails. And not all shades provide exactly the same amount of thermal benefit. And that's something that Ariane has demonstrated. Can I call it your paper, 50 Grades of Shade? Check it out. But all shade is better than no shade. Next slide. And so in our Nature paper, we highlight the fact that shade is not, that full suite of both green and engineered solutions aren't encompassed in how cities are thinking about shades. Few cities know how much shade they have, where the shade is, what's producing it, if it's serving the communities that might need it, right? And so there needs to be a more explicit urban shade infrastructure system, which we define as just a collection of strategically placed environmental shade elements. So it includes all of those, as well as the associated land use policies that would control the production and delivery of shade. And without having an explicit urban shade infrastructure system, the outcome is that we get urban shade deserts. So these are areas of the city that don't have enough shade to support human health and well-being during outdoor activities. And if you look at this National Geographic article that came out a few years ago, it's a transect of the Los Angeles region from north to south. And you can see how there's less trees, lower lying buildings, more spread out, right, as you go down the transect, so you get less and less shade coverage. And that correlates, unfortunately, as these things often do, to income. Next slide. So when we think about schools, on hot sunny days, schoolyard temperatures get really, really hot. And so that's the surface temperatures. But this causes a lot of problem for children. So children are more vulnerable to heat than adults. And when it's extremely hot, it makes it harder to learn. So test scores go down, and there's other outcomes that like they get a little not able to concentrate, fidgety, right? There's all sorts of problems. And those impacts are inequitably distributed by race and class. So we have one study that was conducted through the Luskin Center that showed that there's a 5% achievement gap that can be explained between Black and white students nationally when it's hot outside. But unfortunately, there's no statewide requirements for indoor or outdoor temperature cooling here in California, and that's pretty common across the United States. Nor is there any accounting of infrastructure facilities for what might be climate adapted infrastructure or cool infrastructure, including, if schools even have air conditioning, for instance. Next slide. So one of the important things to keep in mind, as Ariana was talking about, is when you think about the net thermal burden, the way people feel, there's a question, should we be reflecting? And that means using surfaces maybe that don't absorb as much heat, have lower surface temperatures, and reflect that energy back up into the atmosphere, or should we be blocking shade? Right? Those are two solutions that are on the table at schools. And we say that the evidence suggests that blocking is far more effective at protecting children than reflecting. And here's why. If you look at this chart, you're looking at the bottom across 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 12 noon, 2 p.m., and 4 p.m. And the dotted lines show shaded surfaces, and the solid lines show sun-exposed surfaces. And you can see a little bit of variation in the temperature of the surfaces, but the big differentiating factor is whether or not they are shaded or sun exposed. So grass, for instance, might appear cool if you're looking at a land surface temperature map, or you might think, oh, grass is green. But standing above grass, remember those two images that Ariane showed of Marty, one on the asphalt, one in the grass under the tree. Even if you are standing on the grass, you feel quite hot if you're fully sun exposed. So next slide. So here's this kind of illustrated. So here we have two people in the middle standing fully sun exposed on the asphalt and the grass. They both feel quite hot, but if you go under a tree, you feel cooler, even if you're standing on asphalt. So even the hottest surfaces, when they're shaded, are not as hot as somebody feels standing in the sun. And this difference can be just a few feet away. So these, yeah, good, yeah, great. No, move forward. That's enough.
Moving on to shade. So shade is really important, and the question is, how can we quantify the impact of shade or these reflective surfaces on a person's heat experience? And so we built MARDI here at ASU. MARDI is a mobile weather station that measures MRT, mean radiant temperature, the temperature I referred to earlier in this presentation. And MRT, just to recap, summarizes the radiation that hits your body from all directions as you're standing outdoors on a schoolyard or anywhere outdoors. And if you're standing in the sun in Phoenix, Los Angeles, and the Southwest, your mean radiant temperature or heat load can be up to 30 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit higher than if you were standing in the shade. So you can follow Marty on Twitter or X. Marty has an account, and it's essentially a garden cart that you can move around and test different urban situations. So one study that was actually referred to a little bit earlier is a study we conducted in collaboration with the city of Tempe, and we dubbed it the 50 Grades of Shade study, because cities here in the Valley and probably elsewhere oftentimes face the issue that there are a lot of infrastructure challenges. All of these cities in the Southwest have very ambitious tree planting goals. They would like to achieve 25 or higher % average tree canopy cover, but there are a lot of urban infrastructure challenges that prevent these cities from achieving these goals. Power lines, sewer lines underground, businesses complaining that nobody can read their signage. So in collaboration with the city of Tempe, we were looking at alternative shade types to see if any shade is great. Is a tree as effective as a shade sail, for example? And we used Marty to investigate this. And what we did is we We classified shade into 3 different types, or shade infrastructure into 3 different types: lightweight or engineered shade. That could be anything that's temporary, movable, photovoltaic canopies, shade sails, umbrellas, pergolas, anything that's more temporary. Shade from urban form, that's shade from buildings, overhangs, arcades, tunnels, breezeways, and then obviously shade from trees. And we measured these shade types in comparison to sun-exposed reference locations. So we parked Marty on an asphalt parking lot that did not have any shade, and that was the reference heat load. And then we compared the heat load under these shade types to the reference. So what we found was that all shade is great, as I mentioned earlier. What you see here is a chart that shows you the heat load reduction or mean radiant temperature reduction under each of these shade classifications: lightweight structures, natural shade, which is trees, or urban form, which is shade from buildings. And the longer the bars here, the bigger the reduction in mean radiant temperature or heat load. And you see that across all times of day that we sampled, it was all day, noontime when the sun is highest up in the sky, and then afternoon when the air temperature peaks, and then just after sunset. You see that there's actually quite a large benefit from shade. It doesn't matter what shade it is, but shade from urban form, from buildings, overhangs, was actually the most effective shade because it was the most solid or most dense shade. And here in Phoenix, we have this additional constraint that we don't want to use a lot of water because we have water restrictions. So if you can use a shade from urban form or from artificial structures, that actually goes a long way in keeping people cool. So in summary of this study, and there was a QR code earlier that you can follow up on, all shade is great. Shade from urban form and from urban structures is really effective. So if you envision a schoolyard, you could put a shade sail, you could put a tall building next to the schoolyard, and you will get a huge benefit in terms of cooling. We found some differences with the type of trees. We have a lot of native trees here in Phoenix that have a small or lower leaf area density, so that it's not as dense of a shade. So those trees were not as effective, but then again, they don't use water. So that is an added benefit in using these trees. And these results are currently used by the city of Tempe to be incorporated into their new urban forestry plan. So they will actually not just include their tree canopy cover in the plan, but they will include all shade infrastructure, including engineered shade, into their new plan. So now you might, before I pass on to the next speaker, you might wonder, we talked about reflective surfaces. Are they as effective as shade, and can they be a replacement? And the answer is no. So there was an implementation by the Los Angeles Streets Department back in 2017. They were the first to implement cool pavement in the city, and then the city of Phoenix followed suit in 2020, implemented some cool pavement, and we did measurements with Marty and all kinds of other sensors and measurements, and again, there's a QR code here to some of these studies, and what we found was that this cool pavement, the way it works is it increases the reflectivity. So that means that the energy that comes from the sun is reflected back into the atmosphere and not stored in those surfaces. So these surfaces stay cooler and they don't heat up as much. So surface temperature was reduced by up to 10 or even more degrees Fahrenheit. But the impact on air temperature was not as pronounced. And then the impact on the heat load a person experiences walking over these surfaces was actually slightly increased. So it became similar to walking over a sidewalk, a concrete sidewalk. So it's not recommended that this would be a replacement for shade in schoolyards, especially since shade also prevents surfaces from heating up. And I'm handing over to Jenny, who can talk about what happens if you don't shade surfaces on schoolyards.
Thanks, Ari. Yeah, so I'm going to start with these thermal burn thresholds because I really want to take what Kelly and Ariana just talked about and now take it into this next section of what does it mean for kids' health. And so when we think about thermal burn thresholds, we need to understand, like, what does it mean if a child touches rubber for a certain amount of time for their at a certain temperature, and the potential to burn their skin. And this picture is hard to look at, but it is from a child who kicked off their shoes at a playground, which is very normal for kids to do, and burn their feet on rubber. And as in working in my advisory role in a lot of research with the National Program for Playground Safety, I understand why rubber is used around traumatic brain injury and breaking bones and so forth. However, what we're trying to work on is saying if we need to have a softer surface under a slide, under the monkey bars, under some higher structure to prevent traumatic brain injury and other injuries, we need to be able to shade it in these hot climates. How can we shade it at the right time of the day so that burns are not also a potential? And then we're also making a place that's more usable for kids throughout the day. So thinking about all the co-benefits while also recognizing why certain surfaces are used. And I think that's an important space to work within, especially as the mother of a 2-year-old who likes to be very risky in his play. I think about these things a lot, and I want cool playgrounds, but I also want them to be safe. And there's a rule that you can't put grass under slides or monkey bars, because if you do, then it doesn't protect kids from those injuries. So I just wanted to give that caveat to people here when we're thinking about the holistic nature of safety and how can we integrate a lot of this HEATS work into safety that's actually not included yet in safety guidelines, but we're getting there. So just for this example, and we have a lot of questions in the chat around different types of materials and what does it mean for burn potential, or what does it mean for heating up. Essentially metal, because it's more conductive, it's going to have the lowest temperature required to reach burn. But if you coat it, it's really important that it's coated so that it provides that insulation between the hand or the foot and so forth. But plastic slides can be pretty dangerous. Wood is the least dangerous. I'm a big supporter of wood chips, as long as they're deep enough to protect kids from falls, and then also they don't heat up as much, they don't cause burns. But I still am a proponent of shading those wood chips for hot places. So this is a nice resource to have, and I will put in the chat the paper that this comes from a 2016 paper that Dr. Middel and I did. Next slide. I have no control. Okay, so like I mentioned, I want to bring this to the children. What does it mean for thermal comfort? How much sun exposure do they have in these different locations? So I'm going to go through 3 quick studies with you, one done in Lubbock, Texas, one done in San Diego, but more inland in San Diego, where you get more into the desert and hot sun, and then one at a Phoenix playground. And with a lot of these studies, I put sensors on kids. I have this, the weather stations in the playgrounds, and I'm tracking where they're going sometimes, or we're tracking how much activity they're doing with something like an accelerometer or a heart rate monitor. Next slide. So with this study in Lubbock, Texas, I worked at Texas Tech University for a while, and we had this playground in the East Lubbock Promise neighborhood. And we asked the question, what's the impact of shade on personal heat balance of the kids? So taking the mean radiant temperature, the wind, the relative humidity, and the air temperature all together, and then also assessing their thermal comfort and their own preference and their UV radiation exposure. And so what we had them do was play in different areas in the sun or in the shade and prescribe their play. So play Foursquare here, play soccer here. And so we didn't worry, well, I guess I should say, when we compared them doing the exact same activity in this shaded area, which you can see in the shade sail there, doing another of the exact same activity in the sun area, then we could look at how their thermal comfort differed and how their UV exposure differed. So students stated a higher level of thermal comfort in the shade, which is expected, but no one's actually asked kids this before. These were about 9-year-old kids, and no one's asked kids this before, how they feel. We controlled activity levels, so there was no significant difference. But what was interesting with this study, that students often stated that they preferred to be a lot cooler than they were. And the weather on these days was around in the 90s and sunny. They wanted to be a lot cooler, but then and that they were uncomfortable, but then they wanted to keep playing. And that's important to understand as part of the psychological risk factors, that it's really important to give kids play. They want to play, but we have to provide them with safe environments to do so. And you can see this playground has very few shaded areas. They do have grass, but very few shaded areas. And even the shade sail that was provided, they're not allowed to use at recess. And so this study was the first to assess the kids' thermal comfort, how it changes with solar radiation exposure. And even we were measuring only the UV ultraviolet rays that were reaching the kids' skin. And that significantly declined in the sun or in the shade as expected. Next slide. Okay, so this is the study in San Diego. We did about 17 total days where we were looking at warm, sunny weather in the 90s, and we had about 8 children per day, and they were playing out in this playground, and you can see that the playground has this one big tree, and we actually tracked where they played. And so the activity density map on the right-hand side shows you where the kids spent the majority of their time. That was under the tree on these hot days. However, so they spent 90% of their time under the tree. It was much cooler under there. The school even had misters under the tree to keep them cooler. However, they played less. So their overall activity levels were lower because they're more sedentary in the shade. And then they got more activity when they were out in the open sunny area. That's important to understand, not overall surprising, but our hypothesis or our goals moving forward is to demonstrate that if you provided more shade in this playground, that kids would use more of this space more and then get more physical activity. However, there's just very little shade to use, and it's a very small playground already. And so they're not moving as much on hot days because they're seeking shade. And this study is still in progress. And then this last study we've done here with the school that has done a natural redesign of their play space. The map I'm showing is before the nature-based redesign, but they've brought in a lot more trees and such since we've done some of this work. But similarly, warm, sunny days and age groups, younger and older children. And we use what's called So Play, Shade and Nature. So that's helping us assess their physical activity as it relates to shade and nature in the playground and seeing if it's a reliable tool for measuring that. And what we found was with the younger kids, shade was more correlated with different behaviors. So sedentary, light physical activity, moderate or vigorous physical activity, as well as nature interactions. But with older kids, the older they got, the shade correlated, because there wasn't much shade yet, it correlated with more sedentary or light physical activity. So on these hot days, kids are seeking the shade, which is important because it's hot. But if we provided more of it, they could probably use more of the space and we could cool the area. So maybe they wouldn't need to seek it so often. And so our goal here, and we have tremendously increased the canopy cover on this playground, is to continue to do so and continue to look how that changes children's interaction with the shade and nature. Next slide. And then I wanted to briefly mention our Heat Ready Schools program. We started this here in Phoenix in about 2019 or so, really trying to protect kids and teachers and anyone involved in the school system, but especially kids from extreme heat. Next slide. So we get a lot of quotes like this from teachers: it's too hot to play. They go outside for a recess and they're like wilted flowers. And then even teachers are feeling the effects of the heat. So next slide. And then we also get teachers asking questions to the health department on how do they know when to keep kids in for research or for recess? Is it safe for the kids to go outside? Should the school allow the kids to go outside? And then a lot of the schools were unaware of a lot of available decision-making and heat preparedness resources, such as school heat alerts or that they can sign up for through our state health department. Next slide. So we worked to create heat-ready schools, starting in South Phoenix, based on 5 action areas that schools can take around training and education of kids, teachers, and other staff, prevention, school policies that can be used, the community connections, and then the environment. So the environment is where we really focus on tree cover and shade. So, but our definition is that heat-ready schools are those that are able to increasingly identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the negative impacts of schoolyard heat. Next slide. So we did a bunch of interviews and qualitative analyses and literature review to come up with statements that went through 3 iterative rounds of an anonymous Delphi survey to assess the validity, feasibility, and clarity of the statements to come up with a Heat Ready Schools rubric and 30 recommendations. I'll put this link in the chat. It is an open access paper, and then I'll share some of them with you now. Next slide. So here's an example with school policy. So we bolded ones that came out as the most important, but does a school have an emergency response plan? Who's in charge of that? Is there a school nurse on site or a health aide? Not all schools here in Phoenix have that. Are teachers paying attention to the signs, or is there some guideline or policy in place that they need to take a training so they understand what the signs of heat stress are in their students? Next slide. And then you can see environment training and prevention here. We give schools these trees that they can decide what's their most important priority. What have they already done? What's high hanging fruit that's hard to get to, which can be increasing tree canopy, can be one of the hardest things, or increasing shade, to low hanging fruit. What can they do within the next month or two? And what are they already doing to be heat ready? Next slide. So we have a lot of resources available on our website. I'll share that again too. Again, this has been designed mostly for Phoenix. We are working to figure out how it would be adapted for a school in, let's say, California or New York, where the prevalence of air conditioning might differ and where there's different policies at schools. But we worked with our state health department to come up with these recommendations and a lot of these resources. Shade provisioning is one of the hardest ones. I'm going to leave you with an example of one of our heat ready schools on the next slide that has really done a nice job of taking some of the shade recommendations and using spaces that are shaded by kind of both trees and canopy for using for outdoor classrooms or for play or whatever they would like. But I just like this example of a school we visited last week, who is one of our big heat ready schools here in the Valley. And I will turn it back over.
You've seen some great examples of this, but we would recommend that every school should probably be auditing their shade infrastructure. And this is an example from a report. Ariane was co-author on this. We brought Marty out to California, to Pacoima in the San Fernando Valley, and audited shade and temperature and mean radiant temperature. And this is just 2 snapshots from the report, but you can see at high noon, when you would have the least amount of shade because sun is directly overhead. And then later on at 4 o'clock, when you have much higher shade potential. This school is pretty typical, not having enough shade. So very low amounts of shade, 5% to a peak of about 14% during the day. Next slide. And this is by design. In Southern California, our schools are pretty much kind of boilerplate drag and drop in their design. And you notice the same pattern. There's a big area of asphalt. There are some low-lying buildings that are maybe spread out. And then there's trees outside of the perimeter of the school, right? And this design doesn't allow for any shade. And the reason it doesn't allow for any shade is because there's very little verticality and a lot of open space. And so if you look at schools within the neighborhoods they're in, and again, this is a pattern that we see over and over, is that schools have less shade than the neighborhoods they're situated in. So this is a school in Watts. It's one of many of the schools we focused on, showing that pattern. And just a little background in LA, one of the reasons that we have this problem is actually a well-intended policy in the 70s to expand equitable access to play space in embedding requirements for square footage based on enrollments. But the problem is that schools with large enrollments now have larger play space, which at the time was defined as asphalt heavy activity. And now much of this asphalt is sealing in toxic soils underneath. So there are a lot of challenges to kind of reversing this situation. Next slide. We think that arming schools with good, appropriate data is a next step. So we need to consider the context. And so if you look here, we have two charts. You've seen many of these showing air surface and mean radiant temperature. And then on the left side, you see how much sunlight is coming in to the area of a particular school. And we can break this out by things like when is recess, when is lunch, when are after school activities, looking at the bell schedule. So, a serious question here in California, we just had legislation passed that said mandates 30 minutes of recess for all children in schools. Well, are all schools ready to provide 30 minutes of outdoor play or air-conditioned indoor play to students? I would guess probably not. And so it's going to be important to look at these sort of arcs through the day and see how much time is actually safe for children to be having that playtime outside. Next slide. I wanted to refer you also to a policy brief that we produced at the Luskin Center for Innovation, and it goes through a whole gamut of ways that we might protect California children from heat. But I wanted to highlight, so this year, California legislators considered several bills on schools and heat, and only two passed, and the only two that passed had no budget line items associated with them. But here, this is one relevant to our conversation today that I wanted to highlight. So nationally, there's a requirement for a 20% ADA compliance match for any facilities upgrades. And so California had a law that said actually 40%. It was higher than the national threshold. And so this became incredibly burdensome for many schools because they essentially had to double their budget to install a shade structure. So this law rolls back that requirement a little bit, hopefully providing a little relief to schools. So it's a first step, but of course more is needed. And also we need to evaluate, does this actually help schools? Are they actually going to change, what they do with infrastructure? Next slide. We also, I wanted to highlight that we need to be careful when we talk about data. There's a lot of sort of facts flying around, but when we look at shade, you can't look at an entire area because the effects of shade are highly localized. So you might see a lot of studies that talk about large areas or regions and the cooling benefits that you might get, but shade's benefits are super local. So here we're evaluating a particular policy run by CAL FIRE here in California, which provides grants to schools to increase tree canopy by 30%. And so we simulated a baseline. This is a school in Watts, what it looks like now, and what the heat burden is for children now. And then we looked at what the heat burden looks like with a 30% increase in tree canopy. And what we find is that you have to basically get down to the scale of the actual intervention area where the trees are placed to see that that heat mitigation, and it's quite large. And standing directly under the tree, you see the children have a very substantial increase in their thermal comfort. Next slide. And I wanted to end with sort of the elephant in the room is we have to fund all this, right? So right now, here are some general strategies that might be applicable to schools everywhere. So first, you can identify existing funding sources that are underutilized by schools. There are a number of grant programs at the state level that schools may not know that they qualify for. And we can definitely talk about some of those. But schools are considered part of, for instance, in California, OPR's ICARP program. They could be part of the adaptation program, the resilience hubs, and the extreme heat and community resilience program. All three of those existing grant structures exist and schools qualify for them. But we know that schools don't necessarily have the technical expertise or the staff capacity to go after these grants. And so we need to have some sort of way to provide, especially under-resourced districts, with the technical assistance they need to apply for and manage these grants. Otherwise, grants, well intended, could be increasing disparity rather than addressing it. I think there's a need for new funding opportunities that are more durable through legislation, but that's, you know, the hardest lift from a policy perspective. So in the interim, it's important to look at things like one-time federal investments right now from the Inflation Reduction Act that might be things that schools could be capturing. There's also funding nationally through FEMA, through something called the BRIC funding. However, heat is not something that they are currently funding quite a bit. And so there might be a little bit of back and forth figuring out what are the standards that FEMA needs, and then how can schools access that funding. Next slide. Do you all want to say thank you? Thank you. These are QR codes. The one on the left takes you to my heat equity website for the Luskin Center for Innovation. We have, Jenny, we provided your Heat Ready Schools link there, and to the Shade Lab for Ariane and Middel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? We're open for questions.
No, there have, I know some of you have been in the chat. It is heating up, pun intended. So I think it might be helpful just in the few minutes that we have to review a couple of questions that people asked in the chat, and maybe you can expand upon them. So one reminder that you said at the end was that shade is highly localized and that small scale strategies have a big impact. That's just a reminder for the group. One question that came up that I think is quite interesting and relevant to Green Schoolyards America's work is talking about native trees. And I know that people were talking about how desert ecosystem trees have smaller leaves and provide a little bit less shade. We can also think about deciduous trees, and maybe there's some areas of campus where you want more light or less. And not every native tree is that way. We do have evergreen native trees, you know, of course, depending where you are, some trees that have big leaves. So I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I should have clarified with native trees. It was a Phoenix specific study. So I meant the trees that are native to the Phoenix context. I should have probably said desert adapted trees, because we do have a lot of trees here that are desert adapted, that they don't need a lot of water but are not native to this area. But it's the same thing, that they have a smaller leaf area density, and in that they are just slightly less effective if you look at the numbers in terms of the cooling provided through the shade. But again, they provide a lot of water use benefits because these trees are native or desert adapted, so they don't need a lot of water.
That makes sense. And I guess a question I have is, I imagine if you do have a desert climate tree, that's better than no shade and no tree at all.
Yes, planted.
Another question that came up, someone was asking about wheelchair access and shade, and I believe Kelly responded to this and said, as long as it's shaded. So that's a reminder for the group. Engineered wood fiber is accessible in most places. I am only speaking for California, but as long as it's shaded. And then someone else asked a question about artificial turf and heat spectrum. And I know all of you responded to this in the chat about it being really, really hot. So I don't know if you want to just send home the message about those really high heat surfaces.
I'll comment on it a little bit because I've done work on this with sports fields too. And of course, it's very tough to shade a sports field. You can't just put shade over an entire football field, but you can try and make sure the places on the outskirts have shade access for the students when they need a break, or the student athletes and coaches and athletic trainers. But the other interesting thing around artificial turf, and I don't see too much artificial turf in playgrounds, at least here, to be honest, but in the playgrounds I have found it is extremely hot, especially in the middle of the day or kind of early afternoon when it's had its chance to heat up, and that's what most surfaces will do, and then it'll hold the heat and start releasing it overnight. And asphalt actually it won't heat up as much as something like the plastic artificial turf, but it'll retain that heat longer and then emit it overnight. The artificial turf will emit it faster. So it's like, so some of my responses were like, it really depends on the time of day for these different surfaces too. But another thing to look for with artificial turf, I think I saw some comments about rubber mulch and potential toxics of rubber that are in those little the rubber pellets that are in the turf. That's something to watch out for in playgrounds, especially for young kids that are going to be putting that in their mouth because they don't know better. That's something that worries me. But then there's companies coming out with what they're calling cool turf, where it has like sand and zeolite, which is like kitty litter, and some coconut husk, and then it's supposed to stay cooler, but it only stays cooler if you water it. So then we're saying, well, let's put in the turf so that we don't have to water, let's put in the artificial turf so we don't have to water natural turf grass. But then they're saying, we'll put in cool turf, but then to keep the cool turf cool, it has to have water in it so that it can evaporate and keep it cool. It's still plastic grass. And so I think like thinking through a lot of these trade-offs is important. If a school, like a football team with a big football team, oh my gosh, I can't talk. A school with a big football team is wanting to put in artificial turf. Why and what are the trade-offs to consider? And is it actually going to be beneficial? And there's so much to consider around this, depending on the climate, the type of grass that can be grown, so forth, yada, yada. But you do not see many artificial turf fields here in Phoenix because they're too hot to use. And even the city of Phoenix will not put them in anymore. We only see a couple around our ASU campus because they get too hot, and we have them for our teams to practice on. But even though we live in the desert, natural grass put in a more sustainable way that doesn't need as much water, they're almost like reversing back to it. So it's a really interesting space right now. And for a lot of this, when we talk about the artificial turf or the cool pavement, I think we all can be pushing industry to innovate around some of these ideas. And what can they come up with that can be better than what's out there now? There's a ton of competition in this space, so people need to innovate to kind of stand out. So I think we can maybe use that to our benefit a little.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's ridiculous to be watering these surfaces, and people think they're saving water and all of that. Just in our last minute, I want to share with the group that I know Kelly talked about SB 515 about enabling the creation of or the implementation of shade structures without using all of the budget for ADA compliance. I want to share that one of our colleagues recently introduced Senate bill in California 1091, and it does the same thing except including greening projects as part of that, not needing to use the entire budget for ADA compliance. And one of the reasons also is that if you don't do these upgrades, no one benefits from them. And so just to hit home the benefits of trees and vegetation and green spaces, both for shade and cooling, but also for the multiplicity of benefits that they offer, the mental health, the cognitive, the physical, social, emotional benefits, the wildlife habitat benefits. Those are all things that I think everyone in this room can get behind. I think we're at time. I know there's so many more questions in the chat, which is really great to see this level of enthusiasm. Thank you so much, Kelly, Jennifer, Ariane. The research you're doing is literally life-saving. And we're really looking to you and your colleagues to help guide us in this. A reminder for everyone today that our next meeting in this space is Thursday.